We now call the Civil Aviation Safety Authority.
While they're coming to the table, if you want to
Is there any objection to the tendering of the document which we'll refer to as the Freedom of Information claim made by Senator Patrick? There being no objection, that's so tendered. Is there any objection to the opening statement of Recreational Aviation Australia? There being no objection, that will be tendered. Was there another one?
Yeah, there's the Warbirds.
Is there any objection to the tendering of an opening statement by the firstly the Sport Aircraft Association of Australia? There being no objection, that's so tendered. Is there any objection to a transcript of the opening statement of the Warbirds Association? There being none, that is so tendered as well. Welcome, Mr. Carmody.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you, and Mr. Ellick and Mr. Crawford. We're well used to you attending before the committee, and look, before I go to, I want to start with Senator Brockman this time.
Can I make some opening remarks, Senator?
Yeah, we will. Yep. We will. What I'd like you to do to assist us is if in your opening statement or in the questions from the senators, you've heard the evidence. You've heard that the sharp stick arguments in relation to some of this. If there are stuff that would assist us to save asking you 100 questions, we'd really appreciate it. But you're welcome to make an opening statement, Mr. Carmody. Could I just have the witnesses identify their voices for Hansard, please?
Graham Crawford, Group Executive Manager, Aviation.
Well, they won't be confused with anyone else's voice today, Mr. Crawford. Mr. Carmody.
Sure.
Shane Carmody, Chief Executive Officer and Director of Aviation Safety.
Thank you, Mr. Carmody. Mr. Ellick.
Jonathan Alec, Executive Manager, Legal and Regulatory Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Carmody. You have the call.
Thank you, Chair. In just following on from your remarks before I commence, Senator, when I was thinking about what might assist the committee, I have one of my experts here on licensing and medicals, and we could, at the end of my opening remarks, very quickly step through the licences and the medicals to make it very clear to the committee, because some of the information that's crossed over in the last bit of testimony I think is quite confusing, and we could just very quickly step through those licences and those medicals and how they relate to one another.
We'll do that, but I'd like to open the batting with that, Mr. Carmody, to explain. You heard them say we've got an apple and we got an apple, and the rules around this apple are different to the rules around that apple. You need to belt that out of the park or justify it at the very opening, and there may not be a need then to go any further into the difference of the regime. So we just don't want to take the time up with.
And yes, certainly, Senator. Well, let me commence, if I may.
Sure.
Thank you for the invitation, Chair and Senators, and the opportunity to make a brief opening statement. You might be aware that earlier this year we undertook a stakeholder engagement survey which showed a great result compared to our 2015 survey. Over 1,000 people were surveyed, and our results showed an increase to our overall satisfaction rate from 4.2 out of 10 to 6.2 out of 10. Now, that mightn't sound a lot, but as a regulator, we don't expect to get any more than 8 out of 10. So this result demonstrates the reforms that we're putting in place are heading in the right direction. I understand, though, that the committee is interested in the self-administered sports sector and the comparison of the medical and other standards for pilots within the self-administered sector against those CASA regulated pilots. Firstly, I'd like to start with the self-administered sport aviation sector. This sector has been self-administered for many years. They conduct limited operations, and their pilots and aircraft are oversighted by approved organisations that are required to meet CASA's requirements to be approved. These requirements include key personnel with appropriate qualifications and experience, procedures which specify the scope of operations and how the organisation will comply with the regulations and the manual of standards, maintenance of an appropriate structure to manage their approval functions, maintenance of an appropriate audit and surveillance system including safety management systems, processes to ensure procedural fairness for CASA review of internal decisions, and assurance of reasonable, reliable and non-discriminatory access to membership. Using RAOs as an example, and you heard from them this morning, They're a CASA-approved organisation and require people who wish to access the benefits they provide to be members and to pay an annual membership fee. In return, RAOS oversights members' training and aircraft maintenance. Membership also includes a level of public and passenger liability insurance. The level of safety that RAOS offers is less than aircraft certified, operated and maintained under the CASA system, and accordingly they cost less to operate. Consequently, RAOS aircraft are required to display a warning that persons who fly in this aircraft do so at their own risk, and that the aircraft is not operated to the same safety standards as normal commercial passenger flight. CASA Civil Aviation Safety Regulation Part 149, approved self-administering aviation organisations, was made on the 12th of July 2018 and will commence on the 14th of July 2019. It was referenced on a number of occasions today. The proposed regulations were consulted extensively, and it also went through the Aviation Safety Advisory Panel and the technical working groups. The regulations do not compel existing sport and recreational aviation organisations to become approved self-administering organisations. Existing organisations that do not wish to become Part 149 organisations can continue to operate under properly conditioned exemptions, subject to relevant civil aviation legislation, and CASA being satisfied that they are unlikely to have an adverse effect on the safety of air navigation. Such organisations will only be able to expand the scope of their aviation administration functions, that is beyond their pre-Part 149 approvals, or issue additional authorisations if they hold a 149 certificate. On the second matter, medical standards, Australian aviation currently has 5 medical certification standards with different privileges and limitations based on the assessed risk. The minimum licence and medical standard for a pilot wishing to operate in controlled airspace is a recreational pilot licence with a recreational aviation medical certificate, a RAMP-C. This requirement is the same for both an RAOS member, an AOPA member, or for a pilot with no affiliation to any of these organisations. AOPA has questioned why we don't make the self-declaration model available to pilots who are not members of RAOS with the same restrictions that apply to an RAOS pilot certificate, that is less than 600 kilogram aircraft limited to operations outside of controlled airspace. The reason is that we regulate 4 levels of licence, ranging from the RPL up to the ATPL, and there are lots of authorisations in between which we need to elaborate on. As you might know, last year we looked at ways we could provide more options for pilots to fly with less red tape. One of those changes is a new basic Class 2 medical standard. This provides for PPL holders, private pilot licence holders, in most circumstances to visit a GP or a designated aviation medical examiner who will assess them against the commercial driver's licence standard without CASA intervention. There are some limitations, including private operations under day visual flight rules below 10,000 feet, a maximum of 5 passengers, and a maximum takeoff weight of less than 8,618 kilograms. This directly benefits AOPA members. In fact, when we announced these changes, this is an important date too, Senators, in November 17, AOPA was quoted in Australian Flying magazine, and I'll quote it for you. The Australian Airline Operators and Pilots Association of Australia views CASA's decision to base the basic Class 2 medical on the Austroads Commercial Vehicle Driver Standard to be fair and balanced, and commends CASA on enabling the use of general practitioners which will enable pilots to access medical assessments at thousands of locations across Australia. Now that was in November 2017, Senator, when we announced these changes. AMROBA, the Gliding Federation of Australia, and AOPA, who were here at the table a few minutes ago, also signed off unconditionally on the Part 149 self-administration regulations, which were consulted through the technical working groups of which they were a part. And I'm quite happy to table the document with their signatures on it if you would like me to. In conclusion...
So the inference there is that their evidence to this committee wasn't accurate?
Senator, I have a signed letter here, which I'm quite happy to table.
Perhaps they didn't understand the full circumstances.
We'll let them, if we need to, we'll let them speak for themselves.
Senator, perhaps they didn't, but they had a shot, and they've made a number of allegations, and I'm just making the point that they signed off on this as well. We respond to all of AOPA's letters, to the best of my knowledge, maybe not as quickly as they would like. We get a lot of letters. And finally, Senator, I'd say that across some of the evidence today, there's been a fair bit of cherry picking, which is the reason why I would like very briefly to step through how this actually works and also how licensing actually works in medicals in the United States and the United Kingdom, because that's what we do, Senator. I'm quite happy to take some questions.
Let's see if the senators are happy to have that tabled.
That's a signed document from...
That's a signed letter of endorsement for Part 149, approved self-administering organisations.
Yeah. So
and it has the signatures of all of the associations, all of the people who were there.
Just help me out there. So they've agreed that's a good thing, but they're not saying it's a bad thing?
No. Well...
It's just that they don't get access to it, their members.
What they're saying... Well, they could, Senator, if they wanted to be a Part 149 organisation, AOPA could, if it could meet the standards. What they're saying at the moment is there's a general criticism of self-administration, which I heard repeatedly over the last half an hour. I'd have to go back and have a look at the Hansard, but I heard general criticism of what CASA is doing in self-administration, which has been going on for a very long time. Part 149 has been consulted for many, many years and has finally been brought to fruition, finally worked its way through technical working groups, finally worked its way through government to be made. So my understanding, very clear understanding, is that all of these organisations were in the meetings where Part 149 was agreed. Nevertheless, if I may move on, Senator, if you want to get to the apples for apples comparison, I can bring somebody to the table as we can work our way through that very quickly.
We'll see if the senator's interested in that.
Because you might want to get to that point.
Time at the end.
And
could I have the secretary with that document? We'll see if the senators are allowed to be tendered. But just before I go to Senator Brockman, Mr Carmody, just listening very carefully to the question. We've had apples and apples, two apples. They say same people, same aircraft flying in the same space, literally. One self-assesses under 149, one does not. One has to go under CASA assessment. Are you suggesting that if they were to make application to CASA and they met those early requirements that you laid out at the opening of your statement about the ability and expertise and so on, that they too could self-assess off a driver's licence?
What I'm saying is that if they wanted to set themselves up as a self-administering organisation like RAOS, then we'd be happy to consider that, Senator. I am hold on. That's different. The burden of my question was, can they do that now? The answer is, if they were to make application to you, you would consider it on merit. And it's possible that they could become self-assessing organisation. If they were able to reach the requirements, Senator, yes, it is.
Yeah, in the same way that RAOS meets requirements. I imagine they wouldn't be any more onerous or less onerous.
Safety management. Well, they are quite onerous requirements that they meet.
Mr. Carmody, just listen. Sorry.
But there wouldn't be any. Sorry, Senator. There wouldn't be any more onerous.
Correct. That was the burden of my question. All right, Senator Brockman.
Sorry, Senator, can I just answer apples for apples, if I may, just to put...
Sorry?
There are differences, there are restrictions in the recreational aviation space. Senator, only one passenger, less than 600 kilograms, outside of controlled airspace.
Sure. Yeah, that wasn't in contest on the evidence. Senator Brockman.
Yeah, no, just to get back to the apples with apples. So we heard an example earlier where an older pilot is being questioned over his medical certification. It's been challenged. He then says, all too hard, goes to RAOS, is basically flying the same aircraft a few days later. 2 years. For 2 years.
Could be flying the same aircraft if it's under 600 kilograms, if it only takes one passenger, or if he's only taking one passenger, and he's operating outside of controlled airspace. So a lot of people who cannot maintain their medical certificates, a lot of people can't maintain their Class 1. That's why we changed some of the rules for flying training for pilots to be able to conduct flying training with Class 2 medicals to lower the standard. But there are a lot of people in that age bracket who are unable to maintain that higher medical standard. And now they will move to RAOs. The market forces have dictated that they will move there.
But why do they have to go, why do they have to go and pay a membership fee to
Can I not
RRAT?
there, because we're going to get lost here.
Okay.
Well,
No, just Mr Carmody, please. Otherwise we'll only get halfway through this. What I'm understanding Mr Carmody to say is the same person, the same aircraft, with the different testing regimes, only when you get in that same aircraft the second time, you are limited to what you can do versus what you can do in the aircraft number one. So there is a difference.
Correct.
You're going to take off from the ground. There's a difference in what you can do, where you can go, the number of passengers you've got in the back, and that's why the higher standard exists for second licence, the CASA licence. So if that assists you, Senator.
Sorry.
No, I get that. No. Well,
Okay, Senator Brock.
So if you're a GA pilot in the north of Western Australia in the bush, you've got a station up there. Basically, it would be in your interest. You don't take passengers. You fly from station to station. You fly into town occasionally. It would be in your interest, if you're in those circumstances, to leave the GA sector and move to RAOs. So there's a financial advantage in doing so.
It depends on what type of flying you want to do. For example, you're restricted to day visual flight rules, so no instrument flying. So the restrictions if you're going to fly daytime outside of controlled airspace below a certain altitude, then and you want to operate in that space, which is the space that was set up for recreational aviation Australia for recreational pilots. A long time ago, 10 years ago, I think, or possibly more, then that's a good space for you to operate in. And a number of recreational pilots would be doing just that. But for those who want to operate a larger aircraft or take more passengers, so if I use your anecdote, Senator, if I may, and you're on a station and you want to take your family anywhere, well, that's not on. We will limit you to one passenger. We need to, and that's one of the protections that's in place in the recreational space. Limited passenger carriage, limited weight, outside of controlled airspace, not flying at night. And these are the protections that are in place, and they work quite effectively. And organisations like RAOs and the other self-administering organisations you spoke to this morning, who've been consulted extensively on those regulations, are very comfortable with that regime and are very comfortable in moving towards it.
So Mr. Carmody, you acknowledge that the cost has an impact on where people end up in the jigsaw puzzle of deciding whether to be, in the RAOS system or in the GA sector. So cost is an impact, and I note that in the submission to you, RAOS, as I brought up with them, did factor in their significant loss of revenue if recreational pilot licence requirements were reduced. If requirements for other pilots were reduced. But how much of an impact? Did CASA factor that into its decision-making process?
No, Senator, not as far as I know. We started out in the recreational space 10 years ago or so. Jonathan,
Well, more than 10 years ago. It's always been recognised, and as Mr. Carmody said before, that the activities in which you can engage are reduced depending on the category of licence you hold.
We got all that.
Yeah, and so the cost attendant on engaging in an RAOS activity as opposed to a regular activity is something a participant needs to weigh. Is it worth it to me to be able to do more things and therefore pay more for it than it is to do fewer things or with greater restraints and pay less for it? Whether that continues that way on into the future remains to be seen, but that's certainly the way it's been.
But I guess the question for us is, have we got the balance right? When we're hearing about a much sounds, and you can tell me if that's incorrect, sounds like a much more simple, a more simple system in the US and the UK. without the sectionalisation. I mean, it was described as privatisation earlier, putting people into silos.
Well, at that point,
that's why we wanted to explain a couple
just
of-
Mr. Carmody, I'll check. At that point, you've triggered now, Mr. Carmody's made the offer, so we'll take that official to come to the table.
We'll be very brief, Senator, if we can, but it might help explain a couple of things.
Thank you, Senator. My name's Mark Sullivan. I'm the Head of Client Services and Aviation Medicine Branch within CASA. The question that's been asked of me is to describe the various tiers of licences and the medical certification standards that apply to each. What we have in Australia, and this has been mentioned by Mr. Carmody already, is 5 levels of medical certification, 4 of those of which are administered by CASA. The other level of medical certification is a self-declared driver's licence standard, which is applicable to RAL's pilots, but is administered by the road traffic authorities in each state territory. The 4 levels of medical certification standard that we have at CASA, or that are administered by CASA, are the RAMP C. I won't spell out what it actually stands for, but it's a modified Austroads driver's licence standard, and it's an unconditional one, only conditional to the fact that you permitted some eyesight correction. There's the basic Class 2, which is the unconditional Austroads commercial driver's licence standard. And then there's the Class 2, which you're familiar with already, the Class 1, and we have a Class 3, which is for air traffic controllers. But in terms of pilots, there are those 4, the RAMP C, basic Class 2, and Class 1. The levels of licensing in Australia, we have the certificates which are administered by RALs and not within CASA's scope, but we administer the recreational pilot's licence, and to that attaches a number of endorsements that permit the operator of the aircraft to engage in certain flying operations. They start out with a very constrained set of privileges, such as only flying within 25 nautical miles of the aerodrome from which they departed, and the direct route to the training area and back and in between. Then they get endorsements that enable them to extend their privileges. One of those is a controlled airspace endorsement. To operate on an RPL, you only require the RAMP C, the driver's licence standard. You can operate on a Class 2 or a Class 1 if you want, but that's a much higher standard than that's required. A PPL is the private pilot's licence, and that's the subject of a lot of the discussion today. The private pilot's licence can operate on the RAMP C, the basic Class 2, the Class 2 and the Class 1. So all 4 levels of medical certification are available to a PPL. Once we get to a commercial pilot's licence, not only is the standard of training and the standard of competence a lot higher, but so too is the medical standard, with one exception. So the base medical standard is a Class 1, that's a commercial standard. The Class 2 is available to those commercial operator or commercial pilots that want to exercise their privileges in a non-passenger carrying environment. And this is key because it enables very experienced pilots that are no longer able to hold a Class 1 to now deliver their services to industry through the operation under a Class 2. The final level of licensing is the airline transport pilot's licence, the ATPL. That is the highest standard of licence in Australian legislation. It carries some very complex privileges that are associated with it, and it allows the operation of very, very complex aircraft and systems, and that requires a Class 1. Class 1 is the very highest medical standard that's available to us. Now, the question has been asked about a self-declared medical and the operation of such in other jurisdictions. Were we to go ahead and just issue a self-declared or permit a self-declared driver's licence standard in Australia, we would have the most liberal medical certification standard in the world, because not even the US and the UK permit a self-declared medical certification standard out of the gates. What they require first is the pilot or the applicant to pass the gate, to get through what they call an airman Class 3, I think it is in the US, under FAA, they're required to meet a standard first. And more to the point, if they've previously been refused or cancelled, then they've got to be reassessed against that airman's standard. So they can't just go straight in and obtain that self-declared medical. That's also applicable in the UK, where they do have a self-declared standard that's available for certain limited operations of what are called non-EASA aircraft, and these are things like gyroplanes and microlights and there's some home-built aircraft and warbirds and certain warbirds that fit certain criteria. But these are very limited types of aircraft that could be operated under a self-declared medical, akin to what's available under RAOs. Sorry.
Thank you. I think that's given us a good overview. I'm going to go to Senator Steele now, and they'll drill down into those parts that there's no escape for you, Mr. Sullivan. You remain at the table. Senator Steele.
Thanks, Chair. So if someone can help me out here, let's say we've got old Farmer Barry out the back of Queensland there, who's got his plane, and it's got a VH on it or whatever it is. So if he gets to the stage where his medical testing gets too tough, why can't he just take off the VH and then self-assess, like you do with RAOs?
He can, but it means the next day, if I can help drill, he can do much less.
No, I understand that.
Yeah, all right.
I get that. No, I get that. Why does he have to go and join RAOs? That's what I'm leading to. Why can't you people do a deal all around the place and say, well, OK, we're going to make it as easy as possible. Promise you're not allowed in controlled airspace. You're not allowed to fly at night. You're not allowed to have any more than one. You're creating a monopoly. That's what I can see.
Pardon? Yeah, great.
Perhaps I can answer that, Senator Sterle. Essentially, there's two registration schemes currently in Australia. There's a VH registration that we are managing at CASA, and then there's a RRAT. There's nothing to say that you couldn't have a third player came into that mix if that was the solution. If there was demand for it, and I think that's the issue. So, it's difficult for us we obviously want to have some visibility of aircraft operating in the country, and if everybody's got their own register and there's only got their aircraft on it, that's problematic.
I think,
so.
Sorry, Mr. Crawford, I'm trying to be quick. We're on trying to get in my head. So we've got RAOs and we've got Airline Owners and Pilots Association. They aren't a bunch of cowboys. They're respected organisation, years and years of experience, all that sort of stuff. Why aren't they good enough to their members to get a bit of wet and dry it and get the VH off and put something else on it? You haven't convinced me why they have to go and join RAOs.
There's no framework. It's an association, Senator. There's no safety management system. They don't oversight the maintenance of their members. They don't audit their members. They don't do all of the things that are covered under these self-administering organisations, which do, in fact, accept responsibility for the safety of their members and monitor them and manage them. That's what happens under the self-administering arrangements for the 9 self-administering organisations.
So why can't they do that?
Well, essentially, EIOPA could essentially duplicate what RAOS does.
Sorry?
They could essentially duplicate what RAOS has today. EIOPA could do that. That's an option to them, but they would have to get 149 approval. And they'd have to have an effective safety management system, and they'd have to have systems that demonstrate that they've got sufficient oversight of their membership.
And Senator, part of my struggle would be then, most of the RAO's aircraft are configured for one passenger.
But we heard evidence earlier they'll sell this King craft or Beach craft or something. I can tell you about Kenworth and Mack and Scania and all that means. And then essentially just fly the same plane. That evidence was given to us.
It depends a lot on the aircraft and the weight of the aircraft, Senator. If I had to go down that space, for example, I would be asking for all the additional seats to be removed because there's no way that I would be able to oversight that, because Recreational Aviation Australia, that's the design. Right. So there'd be a lot of things that we would need to do, and if I may, the final point at the moment is that, and the reason that these restrictions have been in place for so long is because in the general aviation space and the AOPA space, you have everything from quite small aircraft to very large aircraft. and that is a challenge.
Okay, I've got no problem with.
I'll have to transition in a second, Senator. But
Yep, sure. So have you had the ability to have this conversation with the Australian Owners and Pilots Association? Has there been that two-way street going, hey gang, you want to be part of it? We recognise that it could be seen that we've got a monopoly there because there's only this one organisation that has access to this self-assessing. And you had those conversations?
We've certainly communicated to AOPA that if they wanted the self-declaration medical solution, along with that comes restrictions, and if they're prepared to accept those restrictions, then there's a vehicle to do that.
You've had those conversations?
We've fed that back to them.
From the table this afternoon, he's offered it very clearly that if they want to make an application in the morning, that it'll open negotiations, and when they meet the requirements, they'll be able to do it.
I got that, Chair, but I was just saying, has there been that offer before?
But in some sense, that's quite an extreme process to go down to get to a point where they don't have to go through the same medical for a person within the organisation that flies apples and apples.
Yeah.
That's an extreme method to do that, I imagine.
I guess REOS has been prepared to do that, though, haven't they,
Sure.
Senator?
Sure, no. But you see, my point is that that's quite a burdensome way to go about getting access to relaxed medical certification.
And also, Senator, if I may, many of the other self-administering organisations, of course, do comply with their medical rules. The Warbirds and various others who are talking today. So there is an element of whether you're fit to fly, and we've taken a very risk-based approach on that, and that's why RAOS, with its 10,000 members and 4,000, around 3,000 to 4,000 aircraft, if I understand it, has done very well. And it is actually a new entry point into the industry, and a lot of people are coming in through the RAOS training schools as another entry point into flying training and into the industry, because in RAOS, most of the time, many of the aircraft are new, whereas in the AOPA space, many of the aircraft are old, very old aircraft, and as a consequence, quite often the market has chosen what the market has chosen, which is the entry into the recreational space. The individuals have chosen that.
Maybe if they didn't have to spend so much on ADSB, they would be able to buy new aircraft.
Senator, but it's probably an argument for another day, Senator. But
You've got the call.
Thank you. Thank you. I just want to go back to this letter that you've tabled. You said at the start that this letter has been tabled and signed by all of the people that are at the table, but actually on the page that has all the names and organisations, they don't look like signatures to me. So if I look at the third or fourth name down, this looks to me like an attendance sheet, actually.
You could be right, Senator, and if that's the case, I was in error.
Well, it's a fairly significant misrepresentation if you've...
Except, Senator, if I may, letter of endorsement for Part 149, approved self-administering organisations. This is the attendance list, and then the letter of endorsement is signed
by two people.
Provided below on behalf of all members.
Yeah, but I think that's different. I mean, I've spoken to some of the members that were up before who've said that actually at the time they objected and were not happy with what had been decided upon. I just think for you to come in here and suggest that all these people have signed, actually that is a gross misrepresentation of the facts. That they attended a meeting.
They attended a meeting where they agreed unanimously that Part 149 was set and suitable to be made, Senator, and it has since been made.
I mean, they'll have an opportunity to respond to that offline, but I just make the point. You need to be very careful when you give evidence, Mr. Carmody. The other question I'd ask is about the survey that you conducted. When was that survey conducted?
It was conducted late last year, early this year.
Okay, so there was a 2015...
This is the client stakeholder survey. Yep.
So the 2015 survey that was conducted, was it the same? Did you approach the same people as you approached in 2015?
Senator, it's an anonymous survey, but...
Well, anonymous means the person responding doesn't have to give a name, but in terms of the people who were approached, did you approach the AOPA? Did you approach Sports Aircraft Association of Australia? Did you approach the Gliding Federation of Australia? Those organisations that were here, were they included in the survey?
So, Senator Patrick, we went out to 11,000 respondents. We got just under 1,200 responses.
How did you choose those respondents?
What, the 1,200? We didn't choose them, that was individuals chose to respond.
The 11,000.
Look, this is clear. The senators asked you what methodology you put in place to do the survey. Did you select this organisation, this organisation, this organisation, and send a survey form to 100% of their membership? So how did you find the 11,000 cohort in the first instance? That's the burden of his question. I mean, it gets me cranky when it's plain English questions, and we get these long drawn out answers that are almost non-responsive to the intent of the senator's question. So,
Chair,
would you please revisit the question again and answer it in the spirit of its intent?
Chair, if I may, Mr Walker was responsible for the management of the survey.
Right, well, he should have been whistled up 5 minutes ago. Mr Walker.
Thank you, Chair. My name's Rob Walker. I'm the Executive Manager for Stakeholder Engagement for the Civil Aviation Safety Authority. And yes, I had oversight of the conduct of the survey.
Yes.
I wasn't with the organisation for the 2015 survey, but was for the 2018 survey,
Yes.
which we conducted during April and June of this year. The cohort that was chosen was randomly selected from the CASA database. It was done by a company called Colmar Brunton, who are independent and external research company that are obviously well respected. They were selected through a competitive tender process and were obviously the successful tenderer. We provided them a database for them to select randomly across 11,000 of our stakeholders. The only requirement we had was that we tried to get a truly representative example similar to the one that we had in 2015 across all sectors. So in other words, we had a mix of pilots, licensed aircraft maintenance engineers.
So you did give them certain specs. It wasn't a random selection. It was to be selected randomly, but having regard to these specs.
Sectors, yes. And
so you didn't. Sorry, Mr Crawford's evidence was you surveyed 11,000 people.
No.
Your evidence is you provided 11,000 on a database for them to randomly select, right?
Certainly. If I could just give you a little bit more detail, Chair.
Yeah.
So we had a cohort of 11,000 that we approached. That approach was done via Colmar Brunton, and it was an opt-in or an opt-out type survey. So we couldn't make it compulsory for people to complete the survey. We asked them to participate if they wanted to. We had 1,168 responses from 11,000.
But hold on, how many of the 11,000 did you approach and say, here's a survey of which you can voluntarily participate in?
So there's two components to the survey. One is quantitative, which is the hard online question
Mr
answer.
Walker, one more time. How many of the 11th... Listen, I'll tell you what, we got the people from the transport industry. I'm happy to sit them here till midnight.
Certainly.
We won't leave, so we can go the long path or the short path. How many of the 11,000 were selected and received some sort of indication that they could voluntarily participate in a survey?
11,000, Senator.
11,000 of them, right? So,
11,000.
So, just, Mr Walker, let me just show you why I'm laughing at the moment. You got 11,000 on a database.
Yes.
You then indicate to us that you asked the proponent who won the job, that won the tender, that you'd select cohorts to make sure they're all covered, and now your evidence is that all of them got a survey application.
I'm sorry if I've confused you, Senators. My point is that 11,000 were chosen.
Yes.
The only requirement is that we hoped to have a cohort that represented all sectors of the industry.
Yeah, but Mr Walker, 11,000 were chosen from 11,000 possibilities. Is that correct?
No, 11,000 were chosen out of a database of 50,000.
Ah, there we go now.
So how did
there we go.
Now that was done because Colmar
No,
Brunton-
I'm not interested, but I want the accurate evidence before the committee in the first instance, right?
I'm trying to be accurate.
You should have spat that out about 20 minutes ago. Senator.
Thank you. So there were 11,000 of the 50,000 were randomly selected. Is that how I understand your evidence?
That's correct.
Okay. So who selected the 11,000? That was the independent company?
That's correct.
Okay. And there was some criteria around how to make that selection?
The only request that we had was that we got a representative sample across all sectors.
Okay, so would you be able to, confident in saying that, for example, AOPA there were OAPA members included in the sample,
Yes, I would.
and the Gliding Federation of Australia,
Yes, I would.
and the Sports Aircraft Association of Australia?
Yes, I would.
Okay, so is there any way of working out the distribution of
Yes, that's specified in the report.
So, for example, if one organisation made up 10% of the 50,000 in your database, were your instructions or guidelines to the successful tenderer that 10% of the 11,000 will also come out of that cohort of that association? Was it like that?
That was the plan, Senator, yes.
Okay, so if you've got documentation around this, you call for a tender,
Yes.
you laid it all out, they responded, can you take on notice to provide us? Now listen,
Certainly.
I can again spend 20 minutes, or we can do the A to Z thing, right? Which is
No, I'm trying to be very specific for you, Senator.
everything about that tender process
Yes.
comes to this committee.
Certainly, more than happy to
And
provide that.
the date for that, can I have colleagues concur, be the 3rd of December? So concurred, the 3rd of December.
3rd December, thank you.
and the rationale for the selection? I presume that was in the report.
Sorry, Senator, I missed that.
And the rationale for the selection of the 11,000, was that in the tender or was that in the report?
That's specified in the report. There's obviously some information there that shows exactly where
And
that comes from.
did the survey garner the membership of these various organisations for the participants? I know they're anonymous.
No, it did not.
So how can you be sure that there would be members from those organisations I mentioned?
So of the 1,168 respondents that did actually respond, those are broken down into sectors, and there's over 200 of those that were classified themselves as private pilots. There's also some lesser cohorts that identified themselves as self-administering organisations, and a couple of others that have identified themselves as recreational flyers.
So Senator, we don't know who they were, but we asked them to categorise themselves in the response.
Okay, thank you. I just want to go to the licensing arrangements because I am. I know you were in the back of the room. You heard my evidence, my questions and the evidence that was returned. Just in relation to the rationale behind the medical requirements, in that we may have. How did you get the boundaries that you selected? So, for example, controlled airspace, and how does that relate to medical requirements? There's clearly a need for training requirements, additional training requirements. How do you decide that just because you're operating in controlled airspace that suddenly you need a greater medical standard?
Senator, if it's all right, I'll answer that one.
Sure.
It really comes down to it's a risk-based proposition. If you
I understand, and you heard what I said also.
Yeah,
the rhetoric behind that. I'm actually after the next level down to try and understand why you think the risk increases because you go into controlled airspace.
Exactly.
And how?
Now this turns precisely on the likelihood side of the risk equation. The likelihood of a bad outcome from a pilot incapacitation increases dramatically once you enter controlled airspace because there are more aircraft operating within that environment. In addition, controlled airspace is typically around large built-up areas. So I'm talking Bankstown, Camden, Canberra. These are areas that are surrounded by large numbers of built-up areas, unlike somewhere where you might operate on a recreational pilot certificate, like Holbrook, where I used to fly my ultralights,
Is Hoxton Park controlled airspace?
I'd have to pull out my flight planning software to.
Sure.
We're out of time, and I've got colleagues who want to put some questions on notice. Senator Patrick, is there some way that you can come to a conclusion?
Well, maybe maybe I can ask for what AOPA says is missing, and that is the safety case or the rationale behind how you made that particular decision. I have an FOI that says you made a decision and sets out some of the circumstances, but maybe you could provide the rationale behind these decisions as to medical licensing, describing what the risks are.
Can I recommend something? All of your people are Canberra-based, Mr Carmody.
No, sir.
They're not? So who at the table is not Canberra-based? Mr Sullivan. Everyone else at the table is
I
Canberra-based?
thought you meant all of our...
No.
organisations. Sorry.
This group of people. Senator, why don't we continue this engagement rather than go for questions on notice with all the massive burden of work? Let's just bring our friends back at some time, probably over the next 2 weeks of sittings, where we can find a gap, and we'll continue this because it's significantly important. So are you okay with that? All the colleagues okay with that?
Notwithstanding, I think the information I just asked for would be helpful.
It's a matter for you. It's
I
a
can
matter
answer
for
that
you.
very quickly now, if you like.
Well, and maybe we're about to close because we have estimates following, but could you please spell out how you came to the conclusion that controlled airspace above 10,600 feet, I think you said, or above 690
And we can,
kilos.
Senator. It's the fundamental principles under which our business operates, which is separating passenger traffic.
Sure, but can you just spell that out?
Absolutely.
Spell that out.
We can spell that very clearly.
Thank you very much.
So that's what we do. Senator.
Thank you.
Chair, can I very quickly on the record?
Sure, of course.
To Mr Carmody and co, in relation to the letter you tabled and who was there at the meeting, I'm not convinced for 1 minute, Mr Carmody, that this is a full endorsement of your work. It even goes in there to saying that the subcommittee, whatever the subcommittee is, didn't agree on everything. So you led me down the path of thinking everyone was holding hands and smothering each other with rose petals. Far from it, Mr Carmody.
Well,
if I may.
Mr Carmody, are there minutes that would have accompanied this event?
Senator, I'm not sure. But there is the outcome, which is the regulation that has been made, that they all agreed can be made. None of our regulations, Senator, if I may, just to conclude, none of our regulations, when you get them made, have got everything perfect.
You sat there and gave them a backhander with
no,
that
I said they
presentation
agreed.
to lead us down the path that they were full of bulldust.
I said they agreed.
It would assist the committee. Could you please take on notice as to whether there's minutes for the event, and if you could supply them to us before our next engagement, so if that can happen in the next day or two, Mr Carmody.
Notes which were taken by officials.
A to Z, Mr Carmody again. So anything that would assist this inquiry to arrive at a determination about the parameters around that decision, and then we can all get excited or otherwise with each other. So I want to thank you for your attendance. Sorry to have to bring you back, Mr Sullivan. Where are you based?